Hay que ir a hacer una en México para que esté primo. Sí. Hola, Alfredo. Oye, sí, iba a decir, este está de adorno. Bueno, sí, estaría genial. Este estilo, ¿no? Así como un déjà vu, ¿no? Que fue hace un año. De los tequilas y mezcal, sí. Sí, sí, sí. Quisieras, para no perder la noche. Sorry, guys.
Exactly. So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Beatriz Nava. I am the acting director of the Mexican Cultural Institute. Welcome to the House of the Public and Cultural Diplomacy of Mexico in the United States. We are very glad to have you here, despite of the rain and even before Game 7 of the World Series. So, thank you very much for that. For those who visit the Institute for the first time, as is the case of some of our distinguished panelists, I would like to recall that this house was built by the architects of the West Wing of the White House, commissioned by Mrs. Emily McVie, wife of the Secretary of the Treasury of President Taft in 1910. Mexico acquired it almost 100 years ago in 1921 to become the Chancery of the Embassy of Mexico until 1989 when it moved to its current location in Pennsylvania Avenue, movement which gave birth to the Mexican Cultural Institute in 1990. Throughout these almost 30 years of existence, immigration and the contribution of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the United States has been a constant in our programming priorities. We have featured how migration has shaped the artistic processes of Mexican artists who now call the United States their home, some of them being dreamers themselves, and we have opened a dialogue on the blurry concept of borders, both evident and underlying, from cinema to sculpture and contemporary art. We are honored, therefore, to continue this dialogue and reflection on the Mexican migration to the United States by presenting here Homelands, Patrias, the most recent book by Alfredo Corchado, in presence of the author and David Suro and Ken Trujillo, two of the main characters of the book with whom Alfredo Corchado, engaged in vivid a conversation as the one we will surely witness today, moderated by Her Excellency Martha Bárcena, Ambassador of Mexico to the United States. A few words on our panelists. Alfredo Corchado is the Mexico border correspondent for the Dallas Morning News and author of Midnight in Mexico, a reporter's journey through a country's descent into darkness. Born in Durango, Mexico, he was raised in California and Texas. He began his career in journalism at El Paso Herald-Post before working for the Wall Street Journal. He is a 2009 Harvard Nieman, Woodrow Wilson, Rockefeller, Lannan, US Vex, and IOP Fellow. He is also the winner of the Maria Moores Cabot Prize and Elijah Parrish Lovejoy Award for Courage in Journalism. He has reported on immigration and the reach of Mexican drug cartels into the United States. He was inducted into the Texas Institute of Letters in 2018. Corchado lives between El Paso and Mexico City, but calls the border home. David Suro Piñera is a native of Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico, who has lived in Philadelphia since 1985. He is the owner of one of Philadelphia's longest tenured eateries, Tequila's Restaurant, and launched Siembra Azul Tequila in 2005, which has since garnered international recognition and expanded its product line to include several tequilas and mezcales under the Siembra name. Suro Piñera also owns a fine Mexican spirits importation company, Suro International, and is the president of two nonprofits, the Tequila Interchange Project and the Siembra Suro Foundation. Both of those nonprofits focus on different areas of improving working, living, and regulatory conditions in the agave spirits industry. Ken Trujillo serves as an adjunct professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. For 3 decades, he has represented US and foreign corporations and government entities, executives, lawyers, and other individuals with particular emphasis on contract disputes, securities, antitrust, education, and other regulatory issues. Mr. Trujillo was the principal US outside counsel for Ferrocarriles Nacionales de Mexico, the Mexican National Railway, for years until it was privatized, representing it in US litigation matters and cross-border transactions. He is a recipient of the Otley Award from the Mexican government. Ambassador Martha Bárcena is the first. Okay. We could not have wished for a better panel for tonight. Remember, you can get a copy of the book at the end of the conversation, and hopefully you can join us in the reception that will follow with Tequila Siembra Azul included. So thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Gracias por estar aquí. Since the title itself of the book is Homelands, Patrias, just tell me in which language do you feel more at home, at Homelands? English or Spanish, or should we switch from one to another? To the border.
To the border, binational.
Yes, that is exactly, because we are binational, we are bicultural, and we are bilingual. And that is what makes this book and the community that it portrays the treasure that it is for both the US and Mexico. Very few countries can't really think of having a community that can build so many bridges between two countries, that can be such a source of richness and of future endeavors as the Mexican-American community, and what it's so well reflected in Homelands. I remember when I was a young diplomat and my husband was the spokesman for the foreign ministry, he followed, of course, all the correspondence, the US correspondence on Mexico. And since then, Alfredo Corchado was famous because he was a specialist on border issues, and the Dallas Morning News maybe is one of the newspapers that better covers Mexico on all the areas. So when I arrived as ambassador of Mexico to the US, one of my first trips was to San Antonio. And I went into a small library in one very new, renovated area of San Antonio, a mall, very nice, and they had Homelands there. I saw, oh, Alfredo Corchado, Homelands, this must be an interesting book. So I bought it, hard copy, because hardcover, because the others have not come out. And I think I read it in 3 nights because I couldn't put it down, because it was not only so full of information, but it was so nicely written, and it was written from the heart. So, and if you read it, you fell in love with what he's saying. And all these life going from when he arrives to Philadelphia, he meets David, he meets Ken, Primitivo Rodriguez Oseguera, that we wanted to have him today, but you know, he's a character and he burned his passport. So he couldn't come to the US. So we just have to get used that we having those characters. And this book goes from the arrival of Alfredo to Philadelphia, of Mexicans coming out of the shadows, as he said, and until almost the last years, the election of President Trump. And it has so many reflections and beautiful descriptions of what friendship is, but of the challenges that the community has. So thank you, Alfredo, for writing this book. Thank you for portraying Ken and David as they're almost like novel characters, but they are reality, and they are great. So I would like to ask you the most obvious questions that it's underlying your book. It's the issue of how do you build a narrative based on memories? How did you select the memories, or why were the memories that most impacted you to write this book? And how do you deal? So this is the first question.
Right. Well, I first want to thank Your Excellency for the Marta, for your generosity and support. I think it was about a year ago that I saw the first tweet, and I was so deeply gratified. And since then, we sort of kept the relationship over online.
Twitter.
Yeah, over Twitter more than anything. But thank you so much. And I also want to express my gratitude as an El Pasoan for the altar that you will later see. It's the beginning of a beautiful artwork. So as we sip tequila, we can also admire the art. And most of all, I want to thank you. I know there's another big event tonight. So I want to thank you for coming, for braving the rain and being here this evening. And obviously thank my friends, David and Ken. I think I pulled these guys through a lot over the last 3 years in reporting the book and in going back to memory, which gets to your question. And there's a lot of friends here this evening. I think I would spend the whole evening if I went, back and forth. But just real quick, I mean, Beatriz had asked me to maybe read a passage and then set it up, and through that, hopefully answer your question, Ambassador. After midnight in Mexico, my agent came back to me and said, "What's next?" And I had no idea what was next. But I always knew that I wanted to pay tribute to the Mexican worker, the Mexicans, like my parents, who left Mexico and sacrificed so much to come to a new country. And I felt that that was really the issue at heart. How do I tell that story? I thought through the people who were probably the most supportive at that time. I was a young reporter for the El Paso Herald-Post, and there was an editor for the Wall Street Journal who kept trying to recruit me to come to Philadelphia, and I kept saying no. I was in love with Chihuahua and in love with what was happening at the time on the border. The National Action Party was leading the opposition movement in the north, and I just thought nothing's going to take me away from the region. Finally, the editor got tired of me saying no, or saying, no, can we wait another month or 2 months? He flew into El Paso, brought a bottle of wine, and I was shocked because we had no idea what wine was at the time. My mother made the enchiladas, and I was playing the translator. And during that time, I kept telling my mom, I think he wants to take me away in Spanish, just say no. Just say I'm the oldest and I need to stay home. We had a restaurant. I need to take care of the restaurant. Whatever you do, Mom, say no. And she listened to my bureau chief, Frank Allen. My mother finally looked at him and said, "Take him." And I felt incredibly betrayed that my mother would do this. And she said, the holidays are coming. Can he spend Thanksgiving, Christmas? I will be sure that he's on the plane early January. During that time, I was like terrified. Like, what am I gonna do in Philadelphia? And I kept calling sources, friends of mine in El Paso. Finally, one guy, Victor Munoz, a union activist, um, I said, you know, Vic, is there anyone you know in Philadelphia who's Mexican? And he said, there's one guy, and I think he may not be the only Mexican in Philadelphia, but maybe the entire Northeast. And that was terrifying. His name is Primitivo Rodriguez. Write down the name, write down the phone number. Get to Philadelphia, call, finally answer, bueno. And I thought, that sounds Mexican. And through Primo, we started getting together every Saturday for Indian food. Spicy, because I thought that was the closest thing to Mexican food. And after a few Saturdays, I told Primo, I said, you know, Primo, we got to do better than this. Anything that looks or tastes like Mexican food. And he said the Philadelphia Inquirer just had a story about a new restaurant that's opened up, a restaurant called Tequilas. I'm covering Hershey, Black & Decker for the Wall Street Journal, sort of doing the consumer marketing beat. And I'm already very cynical about that. So I told Primo, that's not Mexican. It's probably some franchise, you know, Chi-Chi's or something. And he says, what do we have to lose? You know, let's go, let's check it out. We ended up that night at Tequilas, and the first thing I was looking at the altar earlier, beautiful altar, and there's an altar to the Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and I looked at Primo, I said, you know, cynically said, these American marketers got it down, you know. They know exactly what to do. There's music playing, Maná, Cruz de Navajas. We're going up the stairs, and we sit behind the bar, and we're looking at this bartender, and I told Primo, this guy is a fake Mexican. So I bet you anything he's Italian. And Primo and I are going back and forth, you know, about these Americans and this guy trying to pretend to be Mexican. He finally comes up to us and says, David Suro, a sus órdenes, soy de Guadalajara, se ve que saben. And that night, we really began this friendship. I mean, Ken Trujillo walked in that evening with Raúl Izaguirre. And we've been friends ever since. I mean, so this book is the book, you know, the universal story about immigration and immigrants and the sense of belonging. But also it's a book about friendship, as the ambassador said. So I want to just read you a quick passage. And, you know, the only thing that the agent said, you know, why through your friends? And I said, because it's a friendship of 30 years and because it helps establish the Mexican presence in the United States over the last 50, 60 years. From the time that I migrated as a six-year-old from Durango, Mexico, right after LBJ stood right next to the Ellis Island and signed the Immigration Nationality Act. So I thought that through that story, through my father, who was a bracero, I could tell the story. David spoke of his passion for food and how he sought to seduce Americans with Mexican culinary culture and spirits. Soft power, a term I would later learn. Ten talked about judicial justice, a vision for a more equal and inclusive country. Primo only hinted at what he was up to, secretly connecting workers on both sides of the border and devising efforts to empower Mexicans in the United States. I told him I just wanted to go home, to find a way back to the border, or the Mexico of my childhood, hopefully as a foreign correspondent for a big US newspaper, an illusion that felt more like a pipe dream at that moment. Years later, looking back on that evening in Philadelphia, it felt as if we were destined to come together that night, in that moment, at Tequila's Table 21. Four strangers bound for the unknown, unhinged from our old comfort zones, embarking on a chaotic journey, 3 immigrants from prominent migrant exporting states in Mexico, Jalisco, Michoacán, Durango, and Ken, the New Mexican, an unwitting ambassador of mainstream America, still searching for his Mexican roots along the way. Our friendship would withstand the passage of time, some better than others. That night, we began a conversation that has lasted more than 30 years, turning on a fundamental and deeply personal question. How do we fit in? What does it mean to be American and become part of its diverse mainstream, integrate into its colorful tapestry, its noble ideals, and timeless democratic principles? Whenever we thought we had figured it out, somehow the entire concept would escape us again. We seek the original idea, and then we destroy it. A cruel irony. So I'll leave it at that, but to get to the ambassador's question, I remember calling David. We were going to meet for dinner that night. I said, David, just met with the agent. She likes the idea of doing this book about friendship and looking through the passage of time. I don't think David or Ken believed me, because they just said, yeah, sure, just come over, we'll have dinner, have tequilas and so forth. And I think that for the longest time they were skeptical, like, nah, this is not going to happen. But I kept asking them. I said, this is before social media, so I said, I need all the, like, for example, David had music lists that he would keep over the years. We fought like hell to try to get pictures. But I said, I'm going to write the book, and the only agreement I made with them was everything I write, it's based on my memory. I want you to go over it and tell me how you remember certain things. I think most of the time we agreed that that's what had happened. I mean, I obviously did a whole outline about the last 50, 60 years in the United States and try to keep that, that sort of narrative flow throughout the book.
Yes, because memory is one of the tricky things. How do you archive memories? How do you get memories in your mind? And normally they are related to emotions.
Right.
So most of the memories that you may have had with David and Ken, it's because they were related to emotions. So when I have read the book, and I was fascinated with it, and then I had a visit to Philadelphia. So the consulate did a great program for me, but they asked if I wanted something special, and I said, yes, I want to meet David Suro. I say, wow, because I read it in the book, so I want to meet him. So that is how I met David and Marite, yes, because I insisted that I have to meet them. And one thing that I discovered about David is that he's very humble, because he said, okay, I have this restaurant, but the Mexican community in Philadelphia will not thrive or do what they are doing without David. He has been key in supporting many projects that a lot of people doesn't know that he supports. A lot of people don't know that he supports, that it's key. And he's a center of attraction. So I was rereading the book, and I was thinking with you, David, with your friendship with Carlos Santana. And Alfredo writes a chapter in which you are at the restaurant and you are with Santana. Santana again, Carlos Santana was more than a customer at Tequilas. David and Santana were friends. The legion of customers at Tequilas had sparked new friendships. And then it says, Alfredo writes, David's mother suddenly looked at them and said, you two may be related, not in names, relatives back in Jalisco. They became convinced they were long-lost brothers. Carlos and I looked at each other and realized that beyond the friendship, there was probably more that brought us together. David recalled the story of their meeting. Maybe there was more, Primo and I thought. Santana met the Mexican in David that he never saw in his native Jalisco. David saw in Santana the brother he never knew he had, and the Mexican he wanted to be, or the one he was in process of becoming, accepted as an American. David defensively denied any comparison. Ni madres, he said. So, David, this gives me is one question. One time, Amado Nervo, a Mexican poet, said of the Mexican diplomats that we represent sometimes not a real country, but the country we dream about. So, and in a sense, I feel in this paragraph that you have rebuilt in your restaurants, in what you're doing in Philadelphia, the country that you ever dreamt about. And with your friendships, the country that you dreamt about, and the brothers that you may have never had in Mexico. So is that true? How did it relate it to Alfredo, to all this life in Philadelphia?
It is very true. I think one a very important element as an immigrant, a very important emotion, and that is represented by one of the most beautiful words in both languages, in English and Spanish, is nostalgia. Nostalgia is such a beautiful word, and what it represents. And I think one of the main forces to, in my case, to inspire me to do what I still do it, is that nostalgia for those elements that you are made of. In that table 21 that Alfredo mentioned in that book, that was our table for the tertulias, a lot of those conversations gravitate around that feeling and that emotion and that beautiful word. And yes, we try to build dreams. We try to build what we wish we have. But yes, the restaurant, it was a very, and I'm not going to say this as an owner of a restaurant, because I think the restaurant is made not just by one individual, the owner. I think a restaurant is made by the people is in that restaurant. And we were there, and these guys attract a lot more people. Sometimes I say more than the food. Yes, the conversation, every night was there, the tertulias. Yeah, it's a beautiful emotion. It's a beautiful feeling that place generate to the three brothers that I met in that restaurant. Yeah, the three brothers that I never had. Yeah.
Thank you. Ken, I can't find the page, but Ken is a different character because he's not an immigrant. He doesn't come from Mexicans that crossed the border, but from Mexicans that were crossed by the border. So from a 7th-generation family in New Mexico. So it is these, which are what I've been saying, the Mexicans are the past, the present, and the future of the United States. And Ken is this part of past. But there is a passage in the book in which Alfredo writes that you said, I felt more Mexican in Philadelphia tequilas that I never felt in New Mexico. So what is this approach or this sensation of a 7th-generation Mexican-American? How do you relate then to the newcomers? How do you identify with them?
Well, you're exactly right. Oops. We did immigrate. My family did in the 1600s to Mexico. And then the border was moved on us in the mid-1800s. Philadelphia for me, I came to Philadelphia in 1983 to go to law school. Growing up in New Mexico and Colorado, in New Mexico, there's more Mexican Americans than there are non-Mexican Americans, right? So you, like in Utah and other states in the Southwest, I was never really very aware of being Mexican American. It was the most normal thing in the world. so I had very little awareness of it. I actually spoke, my first language was Spanish, but then I unlearned Spanish because of my Spanish accent. I wanted to, and had people who made fun of my accent, so I wanted to speak English perfectly, so I virtually unlearned Spanish. And then it was when I met these guys in the 1980s that I fell in love with Mexico in a way that I had never been able, because I had only been to Mexico one time before I met these guys, and I had been in Juarez, Mexico for about half a day because I had fallen and we didn't have a lot of money. My parents took me down there to get some dental work done. That's the only reason I'd ever been to Mexico, and it had been to Juarez for half a day. Once I met them, and then I started doing work for Ferrocarriles, during the 1990s, I spent probably half of my life in Mexico, and we were constantly there. So I relearned Spanish largely because of our friendship.
That's fantastic. I don't want to go on, continue asking, so it will be the last question, and then we open the floor. And my question is almost at the end of the book, Alfredo. It's election night, and you are shocked. So you write, politics was so divisive we could face another civil war, hopefully bloodless, because remnants of black and white issues still lingered, and things had turned even more complicated with so many Muslims, Asians, and especially Latinos. That would just scare them more. Instead, I kept my thoughts to myself. I wanted to tell his mother, I just wanted to go home, curl myself with them and watch telenovelas and home for the holidays. Listen to Nat King Cole, maybe Unforgettable? No? Christmas song. But that would show weakness. She needed me to be strong. No sé qué decir, mamá. I don't know what to say. I guess I have to watch Jorge Ramos to see what happened, she said. Well, I took this as a dig. She usually used Jorge Ramos, Univision Top's anchor, whenever she wanted to annoy me. And especially now because Jorge Ramos was dancing the line between journalism and activism. She knew it would get to me, especially now that I was no longer a journalist. Why couldn't I express my anger now? What was holding me back? My mother and sister would ask. I respect the profession too much, I would say, though at times this sounded like a lame excuse. Plus, I'm really curious now about why they, meaning Trump base, hate us. How did we go from the shadows to the spotlight shining on us? When exactly did we stop being a novelty and become a threat? And my question is, how do we go in the spotlight from becoming a threat to becoming the hope of this country and of Mexico?
Just a little context. That last month before the election, it was like a running debate between my parents and myself. We had just been to Durango. I think it was a week before. I took my parents for Dia de Muertos. And my mother was asking the question, did we do the right thing? Did we do the right thing in sacrificing everything we knew to come to the United States? Knowing she had a feeling that this could happen. I didn't imagine that could happen. That President Trump would become president. And I was at a loss of words. I had left journalism for about a year. I was teaching at ASU and also writing this book. So there was a big part of me that my mother thought, I could maybe get him to talk to me about what's happening. I mean, why is it happening? And I really couldn't really give her a straight answer. That we had again become political piñatas on the border. That politicians for long had looked at the border as a place where you hit them and hit them and hit them, and then you watch your political points go up. Um, and there was a feeling, I guess, back then, all this, the rhetoric was getting harsher. The things that were being said, the actions that we saw, the debate about the border, that something was going to happen. A lot of people look at what happened August 3rd and they seem surprised. I wasn't that surprised that there was a mass shooting in El Paso. I think a month before that, I was covering a press conference with the Hispanic congressional delegation, people from the so-called squad, and there was so much anger, so much hatred, that I thought, I remember talking to a policeman in front of me. There was the little press conference in the middle, then you had the journalists, and then you had all these other MAGA supporters at the end, just screaming and shouting. And the woman next to me was one of the protesters, and I kept looking at the side, and I kept thinking, this woman has a gun. And I tell the police, I said, I think she has a gun. And the guy looked at me and says, it's Texas, it's open carry. There's nothing we can do. And I walked away, and I think 3.5 weeks later, we had the El Paso shooting. That was a real sense of reflection. I asked the question in the beginning, how do we fit in? How do we belong? And I think the El Paso shooting was, to me, a real sign of, we have no choice. I mean, in many ways, we are more Americans than the person who came from North Texas, Allen, Texas, to shoot Mexicans because he felt threatened that Mexicans were invading the rest of Texas. I felt that as Mexicans or as immigrants, whether it's Asian, whether it's as Muslims, we still believe in the American soul, the American immigrant. And I feel that the only way that we can really recapture that sense of hope, that sense of immigrant spirit in this country, is to participate. That we have to go out and vote and be counted. I mean, that was my takeaway from what's happened.
Thank you. So, open to questions, comments. I think it's nice to have a dialogue. Sí, adelante.
I wrote it in English. But my mother approved when she read it in Spanish. Yeah, right. Yeah, it's the book came out in Bloomsbury in English, and then just about 3 weeks ago, it came out in Spanish by Random House in the United States, and it came out in Mexico back in May of this year. Great question.
Here we have Andrew Seeley, the chair of Migration Policy Institute, and he has written also a book called Vanishing Frontiers. So, Andrew, I would like you to maybe try to interact with Alfredo, with David, on what do you see of coincidences or not coincidences between your book and what you are portraying in Vanishing Frontiers and what Alfredo is writing about in Homelands?
Before Andrew says anything, I want to thank Andrew because he's helped support the last two books. We share the same birthday, January the 12th. And we really have supported each other through Homelands and through Vanishing Frontiers. I was just in Allegheny College, by the way, in Pennsylvania, where the students are using your book for class.
Well, I wish I could write like Alfredo. I mean, he is a poet when he writes, so it is. I recommend, for those who haven't read the books yet, both of them, highly recommend it. They read like novels, even though they have the depth of nonfiction. I was wondering, the last thing you said, you wrote a very powerful article the other day after the shooting in El Paso. I mean, it was really a gut-wrenching article. And it ties into what you just said, which is, how did we go from being a curiosity to being a threat, right? And it says something about the change in the relationship between Mexico and the United States and Mexican Americans and the United States as well, right? I mean, it is, you know, four guys in a restaurant hanging out, drinking tequila is a curiosity. You know, actual political power, economic power is a huge advantage, but is to some people a huge threat, right? And I find this sometimes, without trying to get political here, when our president talks about Mexico, occasionally it's that old canard about Mexico being less, but occasionally it's a new one about Mexicans getting the better of the United States. And you hear this actually from people that are threatened by Mexico or by Latinos sometimes. I mean, sometimes it's the old sort of inferiority talk, but sometimes there's something about Mexicans somehow being better than us, or somehow Latinos are actually doing better than everyone else. I mean, and I'm just curious. I mean, I think the truth behind this is that, in fact, Mexico has a huge influence in life in the United States in a way. You know, Mexico was also it was a nice neighbor to have, but it was, you know, it was sort of an afterthought. Mexico's become a significant country in the life of most Americans, even if we don't realize it. The Latino population was, unless you were in the Southwest or Chicago, was a small part of the population. It's become everywhere. It's become part of political establishment. Yes, there's discrimination and if you want, but I mean, Latinos are in the political establishment and the economic establishment. How is the country reacting to this? And how do we get from where we are today, where there's both broad acceptance for Mexico and for Mexican Americans, but there's also, we begin to see the El Pasos happening and we begin to see some of the rhetoric we've seen out of the White House. How do we get from here to a future that looks different?
I mean,
I know it's a totally unfair question to ask you.
yeah, I know, especially to ask a journalist.
The great thing, though, Alfredo, is I have to say, when you started writing the first book, I remember one of our early conversations said, I'm a journalist. I can't really put myself in this, right? I'm supposed to report outside events. You've been phenomenal at putting yourself in and really both being able to look as a journalist on what's happening around, but also place yourself and your emotions in the story, which is so important in your perspective.
That's more a tribute to the editors. I remember when I first sent my first draft, it came back with all these red marks, you know, and basically says, you know, it sucks. It's terrible. And he kept saying, no, you got to get off the sidelines. You can't be a journalist. You have to be a human being. And that's something that I've learned. And it's not a plug for tequilas, but that's why Siembra Azul, I think, has helped me so much. It's to, you know, to try to really have a conversation with myself, with, you know, the tequila plus the music. But I think, you know, it goes back to the debate, you know, the browning of America and the graying of America, and the sense of, you know, people feel threatened. It was interesting when I was reporting this book. I traveled through Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, and people know you were on the record, you know, and the whole conversation was really a debate about the wall and why we need a wall. And then they would see me turn the recorder off, and they would ask, hey, why aren't the Mexicans coming anymore? And I would say, well, you know, Mexico is, the great Mexican migration is virtually over. I mean, it's 2007 and late 2000s. I mean, you start seeing the numbers really decline. I said, you know, there are more jobs in Mexico. The demographics have changed drastically from 7 children to 2. And the smuggling operations have gotten more dangerous, more complex. Plus, they don't feel welcome here. And you got a sense that they really miss the Mexicans, that they really want the Mexicans. It's the same thing that David and I talk a lot. You know, they come to tequilas, they really want the food, they want the spirits, but there's still a sense of we are being invaded. You know, very much like the shooter from North Texas. A sense that this is happening. You know, people tell me, you know, it's that moment when a defining moment in this country, when you have to face it and try to move forward in a joint way. I know David has some opinions as well as Ken.
I do think that the question of the question you ask is a critical question for the very simple reason that, and I think some of it is math and some of it is purely the circumstance of where especially immigrants are in the United States. So if you're an undocumented from Mexico here, you are not going to voice very much opposition. At the same time, there is an entire infrastructure that has been set up to create a permission structure granting permission to normalize abnormal behavior to go after immigrants. And so what we've seen over the last several years is the normalization of hatred and a permission structure. If you think about it, when the President of the United States gives people permission to hate, that is a powerful, powerful tool, and especially when it's to act against and to hate people who who are living in the shadows and finding it almost impossible to defend themselves. My view is, and this is not as an author, this is that the only way you can respond to that is that the people who are not living in the shadows, and this is where I think Mexican Americans, Latinos in the United States, we don't do a very good job. We have to speak up not only for ourselves, but for those that are being attacked. And so the question of do we belong here, to me, is clearly the answer to that is yes. If you look at simply history, we belong here way more than virtually anybody else with the exception of the American Indian. But we are in a period in history in which there are a lot of people who have been successful in conflating undocumented immigrants with me. Senator Bob Menendez said it very clearly when he said, when they say they're talking about the undocumented, guess what? They're talking about me. That's exactly what, in my view, has happened. And so why, to me, that's also why the voice of the documented, of those of us that have been here for 7 generations, for 2 generations, for 1 generation, become the most powerful. And I also think that that's why books like yours and voices like yours become important tools to really take the wrap off of this normalizing absolutely abnormal behavior.
Well, I'm going to focus on my area, which is the restaurant industry. Philadelphia, the city of brother-in-law, is one of the most vibrant cities right now, culinarily speaking. The level of sophistication we reach on our culinary propositions in just great restaurants through the city are happening thanks to the labor that it comes from Mexico, especially from Puebla, from San Mateo, Osolco, Puebla. We have this tiny, beautiful town right next to the Popocatépetl volcano that started this migration to Philadelphia in the early 2000s. Alfredo covered that story of the first guy who found himself on Locust Street looking for directions on how to get to New York City because the coyote dropped him in Philadelphia. He has to go back to Mexico to get more guys, to the border to get more guys, and he just dropped him in Philadelphia. And he saw this restaurant, the canopy outside of the restaurant, it's Cocina Mexicana. Immediately went there and knocked at the door and asked for directions. I said, okay, yes, are you driving or how are you going to get there? He said, I don't know. The coyote just dropped me off. Said, oh my God. Back then, there was no Mexicans. That's what Alfredo described, that we were no Mexicans in that area. And there was a real challenge for the restaurateurs to do what they want to do because the lack of labor. And this guy started to work at the restaurant, I started to show off with my colleagues in Center City that I finally get a person who is capable to keep up with the rhythm that we need to grow. I said, oh, you think he knows anybody? I said, let me ask. Well, like 20,000 migrants later, the city now is an incredible town when it comes to food. Millions, billions of dollars are generated in the economy of the region thanks to the labor force of people who comes from Mexico. But also the city of Brotherly Law, which is it's a very progressive city. I'm pretty sure a lot of you are familiar. It's a city that in my 35 years of being blessed by being part of that society, that community, we never have an issue. It was a great acceptance by the downtown community, by the city community. And since this new administration, we've been having sticker notes outside the restaurant telling us to go back. That never happened in Philadelphia. But also, you know, I published something in social media related to that. I was so happy and very optimistic for a brighter future because there was the reaction of the people who just disagree with that negativism, with that aggressiveness, with that nonsense, also show up. And they raise their voices. And the support has been incredible for the restaurant and for our community in Philadelphia. So I'm very optimistic that this is a great lesson on human behavior and you know, I feel right now, and it's a conversation, thanks to this liquid, we have this very wet conversation not too long ago, Alfredo and myself. For years I was fighting against identity, you know, because I'm 58 years old. I've been in Philadelphia for 35 years, but I'm very Mexican. I'm extremely Mexican in many things, but I've been here for, you know, the longest period of time in my life. I really care about seeing a city, a country, countries they can talk to each other, recognize each other, and how much depend from each other, and how well we work together when we work together. Yes.
Hosting this event tonight, and thank Alfredo. You know, our stories are powerful and they need to be told. And through Homelands, you have told your story and your story of your friends. And I want to thank you for that. That's an important contribution, particularly at a time of this negative narrative that comes from the White House and too many other places around our country. And I'm wondering, Alfredo, you know, you and I met in Houston last year. Your book had just been published. And I'm wondering the reaction to your book. Have you received any critical comments about your book? And what are those? And how have you responded to that?
I've been lucky. I mean, it hasn't really happened much. And I've tried to go more into the states that, you know, that we're told that the debate is taking place, you know, states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and others. And so far, so good. I mean, but I think you also see a lack of information. And it's good to have that dialogue, and especially these states outside of the Southwest. That's one of the things I've been trying to do with the paperback version. You know, it's obviously it's cheaper, and trying to get more colleges, universities, to more than anything, you know, have a dialogue, have a conversation. It's in Mexico, it's been a little more of a pushback. You know, the whole sense that you don't really belong. Although I don't think it's as bad as it was when I first arrived as a correspondent in '94. I mean, I think Mexico has really become a much more sophisticated country about its own sons and daughters who live in the United States. So, knock on wood, right? That so far it's been so good. I do want to acknowledge Diana from Puebla, and she gave me a very powerful story. Probably the youngest person in this room right now, but I mean, I looked at her, I talked to her, and you look through her story that there's a very promising future in this country. You know, that's it.
Yes, just a quick thing about the book. I think one of the beautiful subtexts of Homelands is the story of Philadelphia. Ken and David, I'm wondering, what is it about Philadelphia in the time that both of you have spent there? You're deeply into politics in Pennsylvania. Apart from being a kick-ass lawyer, you're also a media mogul. and David, I mean, the things that you've supported in Philadelphia have been, I think, is remarkable. And so those are great personal stories, but what is it about the transformation of Philadelphia that stands perhaps as an allegory and perhaps as a way that the rest of the U.S. can go in accepting and becoming just a community of mixed people, of people from all over? I mean, every time I go to Philadelphia, I'm just amazed by the multicultural sense that I get in the city center in particular, but also now increasingly in the neighborhoods and in the suburbs of Philadelphia. What is it that you've seen in the last 3 decades that has made that possible?
For me, and I've described Philadelphia in my experience as Philadelphia having and being a blank slate, because back when there were phone books, when I first came to Philadelphia and had my first own phone line, I was the only Trujillo in the phone book, right? So that gives you an idea of how few Mexican Americans, Latinos there were in Philadelphia. I stayed in Philadelphia thinking I'd be discriminated against in practicing law in society, and the opposite has been the case for me. I will tell you, I can't think of a moment in the last 36 years where I can say somebody was discriminating against me. To the contrary, that blank slate, I think, people didn't quite know what to make of us. And so really, at least my experience was that I had an open opportunity and I was a little different, so I stood out maybe a little bit more than somebody else who graduated in the same kind of circumstance that I did. Philadelphia is a remarkable city. It's a city of neighborhoods, and there is racial strife. There are, but much of the racial strife has been more black-white than brown, I think, and there are some other phenomena that are going on there, but it is fairly remarkable that a city that is a tough city for a lot of people has been, in my view, an incredibly welcoming city for immigrants, not just Latinos. I think if you ask Russian immigrants, if you ask Muslims, people who've come from all over the world, I hear very, very few stories and the only thing that I've seen is very recent, but I've never really experienced it.
Yeah, it's one of the oldest city in the country, and I think that says a lot that the experiences of different groups, immigrant groups, they arrived to United States from Europe, and there was multiple ways that the improved society they can be engaged and they can coexist together. I think Philadelphia is a great example of that. I noticed, now due to the spirits business, I travel all over the United States, and I see that is repeating in a lot of cities where the suburbs are moving back to the downtowns areas, the restructure of the cities, and migration from old cities to the new cities. But Philadelphia, I think it has just, historically, it's been like that. It's been a city to welcome everybody. I mean, it was, when it comes to the Latino community, it's fascinated because South Philadelphia, for those of you who are not familiar with the city, but that South Philadelphia was the area of the city that was known by being the receptor of the new waves of immigrants. And the last wave is the Mexican wave. That was a neighborhood that back in the 80s and the 90s started to deteriorate rapidly because the Italian community who live in that part of the city was moving to the suburbs. And it was fascinating to see how a neighborhood that was going down, you start to see this revival of this part of the city by the little shops, the families, kids on the streets, and you see how integrated to the rest of the city is South Philadelphia. So it's a city that it can be a very good example for many cities due to the experience of the city, how mature the city is, and it works. It works. Yeah. I have a question. Can we do a salute here before, see. Sorry, guys. Yeah, it's been evaporated. But yeah, I mean that's.
I have to make one quick comment just because, and Alfredo mentioned her, but I will tell you, I feel so close to Diana. I do. He mentioned her. She's in the 9th grade. She bought the book months ago, read through it, knew all of our stories. Her mother, born in Puebla, from Puebla. I talk about the quintessential immigrant story. The reason I felt so close to her is that my experience was not an immigrant experience, but my wife always says that I must have been dropped off by aliens because I grew up in New Mexico and Colorado and had virtually no direction of how to get to college, go to law school, etc. And it was only because there was one lawyer who I heard, and I think you ended up interviewing him, right, about being a lawyer. And so I have to tell you, Deanna, I'm so impressed with your absolute, just the energy and the courage that it takes to do what you're doing. And I just want to make sure everybody lifts you up, and anybody around here should do whatever they can to make sure, because you're gonna do amazing things.
And I want to add one thing for Diana. Diana, I'm sorry I'm going to put you in the spot, but you want to stand up for just 1 second? Diana? Yes. And she's 14 years old. It's beautiful. And one of the plans that she has for the future, one of the possibilities is to be a restaurateur. So that's just something, yeah.
There's one more.
Good evening. I'm Eduardo Diaz. I work at the Smithsonian Latino Center here in D.C. First, I want to thank Mr. Suro for opening the restaurant, because I remember being in Philadelphia probably 1990s, and I was very desperate myself. And by just looking around, found your place, and that's changed my opinion of Philadelphia forever. And I guess to Alfredo, I think one of the things that we reference Puebla, right, because of the majority of the Mexicanos that live in Philadelphia and New York are from Puebla. And I'm always very humored by the notion that if you're running for governor of the state of Puebla, you have to make a campaign in New York and Philadelphia if you have any intentions of winning the race at the end of the day. So my question is, to Alfredo particularly, is this notion of Mexicanidad in the Northeast and the places that are outside of the usual suspect cities, Chicago, San Antonio, El Paso, Los Angeles, Albuquerque, etc., Denver, and so forth. Because what I'm seeing at the Smithsonian, what we're looking at in terms of the Latino population mix is the places in, for example, the South, right? Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh, Durham, Birmingham, Alabama, and in New York and also as well. I would really like to see more writing about the Mexican population in these non-usual suspect areas, because I think what we're seeing is an amazing pattern of entrepreneurship, creativity, and growth in places like Birmingham, Alabama, where you have entrepreneurs from San Luis Potosí starting radio stations, grocery stores, construction companies, etc. So I'm hoping at some point or other that there's, maybe not you, but maybe some other journalists and writers can take on that challenge, because I think it's a story that needs to be told soon.
I just want to say that with us tonight is Yasmin Ulloa from the Boston Globe, and she's been reporting a lot on politics, but also looking at the demographic changes in this country. So you guys are a tie. She's a fellow El Paso, and that's why I'm so fond of her. We go back many years. My sister was a editor in high school. Thank you, Eduardo.
Just elaborate a little bit about, that you talked about. I have the same kind of relationship with my mom about Jorge Ramos. He's like, well, Jorge Ramos says it. I'm like, well, I can't be that far out there. Like I need to be a little bit more toward the center, especially if I'm like going into the White House every day. Like there are boundaries that we have to play by. And do you think that are we doing enough as Latino journalists when we're so angry?
That's a tough question. I mean, I think I'm very honest with myself, and I realize that I'm born in Mexico, so I'm Mexican. I'm an immigrant, and I'm a journalist. And it looks like big three strikes, in the current climate. And all it does is really it pushes me more to try to. Obviously, I'm biased. I mean, I'm a human being. But it just pushes me more to try to get as many opinions as possible into any story I write. I will tell you that last piece I wrote that Andrew referenced to was a piece that my editor had called me like on a Friday and said, we need this story by Monday. And it was a Grito weekend. I happened to be in Mexico City. And so I think it was feeling like sort of the nationalism and so forth, and being in Mexico, and it's something special these days when, as a Mexican immigrant, you feel like you're under attack to go back to Mexico. You feel like this is the place to be. But I wrote that piece that weekend. I sent it to Angela Cocherga, my significant other, and she read it, and she said it's really powerful. But maybe tone down some of the anger in you. And I thought, this is exactly how I feel. Not as a journalist, but as an El Pasoan, as a border guy, as a Mexican. And it was a sense of freedom, if you will. I didn't get as much pushback as I thought. I mean, some readers did reference to, but I think it was one of those rare moments that you can just cross that line and say, this is what this meant to me. And we're talking about the El Paso shooting. It happened on my father's 83rd birthday, so it was a real personal narrative. We can talk about it some more over tequila.
Sí, adelante. Sí.
Gracias. Bueno, son dos preguntas. Las voy a hacer en español, ¿está bien?
Claro.
Sí. Una para David y la otra para Alfredo. David,
la nostalgia de la que hablas, hoy en día el mexicano se aferra a esa nostalgia, a traer un pedacito de México aquí. ¿Y por qué? Y Alfredo, ¿cuáles serían, digamos, los paradigmas para estas nuevas generaciones que tendrían que romper para internacionalizarse y que el proceso de internacionalización sea más flexible? Como decía la embajadora al principio, somos binacionales, no un mexicano viviendo en Estados Unidos, ¿sí? Entonces, un mexicano internacionalizado, ¿no? ¿Cuál sería tu recomendación, digamos, para estas generaciones, el entender el proceso de internacionalizarse y que sea un proceso menos doloroso y menos sacrificado para las nuevas generaciones? Obviamente en la frontera, ahí nos conocimos en El Paso, yo viví 17 años en El Paso, es una comunidad que es un ejemplo de cómo los dos países pueden trabajar perfectamente, las fronteras. O sea, ahí estás. Cuando vienes al interior te das cuenta que es muy diferente, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, ahí están las preguntas.
We by default, I think Mexicans, we are nostalgic people. You know, if you see the way that we are, our culture is, music, just the way that we interact among ourselves, and we bring that with us. That's one of the beauties of our culture. It's people, and I think that is one thing that I find in my case. Philadelphia is not like if you migrate to California or Illinois or Texas, or New York. Back in the 80s, there was already a significant amount of Mexicans living there where you can find a comfort zone as a new immigrant. For me and then for the group of friends, we have to build that. Again, that nostalgia helped us to it was the best tool that we have to build that and to be as Mexican as we can be. You know, so that's one of the things that we always our conversations when we sit and we get in these bohemian conversations. Again, gravitates around how much we miss our culture, but how much we've been working and try to bring that culture near us. Yeah.
I think one of the probably the best things that my mother did. I mean, she did a lot of amazing things, but one of the things that I'm more gratified to her about was that she never let me forget Mexico. I mean, she made sure that Mexico was always present, whether it was through Javier Solís or Jose Pedro Jimenez, Juan Gabriel. I mean, Mexico was always there. And I think that gave me a sense of identity. I mean, even though I grew up in California and there was much more of a conflict, but I think I was always very sure of who I was. You know, even though at times I lost the language or the ability to speak Spanish, fluently, but I think that gives you a sense of, it's okay to be bilingual, be bicultural, be binational, and that in turn makes you much more international. And will always be grateful to these two guys because they created this environment in Philadelphia where I could also feel very Mexican and yet, felt like I could belong in this country.
También voy a hablar en español. Para no desentonar, yo nací, crecí en el Centro Histórico de Puebla y llegué a Estados Unidos en el 74 a vivir en el West Side de San Antonio. Me casé con un chicano y luego viví en Boston, Massachusetts por la gran mayoría de estos años y acá los últimos 12 años. Entonces, para mí lo que me ha ayudado mucho, todo lo que ustedes han mencionado, ese sentido de identidad. Pero también en todos esos años he tratado de aprender más de este país desde que llegué. Y me he dado cuenta que es de puros inmigrantes, excepto de los indígenas. Pero la última migración, la más reciente, es la de nosotros, aunque aquí hemos estado cientos de años, ¿no? Y la última migración es la que siempre sufre la mayor discriminación. A través de la discriminación que los latinos aquí en este país pasamos, pasaron los italianos, los alemanes cuando llegaron, porque los judíos que llegaron, era gente que migra porque quiere buscar una mejor vida para ellos y para su familia. Entonces, siempre los nuevos migrantes son los que son discriminados. Entonces, para mí ese aprendizaje me ha ayudado mucho. También hay una alta, la hemos mencionado aquí ya varias personas, la falta de conocimiento de la historia. Aquí mucha gente no sabe su propia historia, la historia de Estados Unidos, no saben en los libros la historia de la esclavitud, de México, de los mexicanos aquí, pues no la enseñan. Entonces hay una falta de conocimiento sobre eso en este país que es muy profunda. Y también otra cosa que para mí me ha ayudado como a integrarme a la cultura de aquí, bueno, que ha llegado esa ola de migrantes que llegaron en los últimos de 2000, del 1995 al 2015, digamos, que llegó tanta gente, que es por eso que se sintió tan amenazada la población gringa, pues eso ya es irreversible. Está en la cultura norteamericana tiene de todo. Aquí ya comen más guacamole y salsa que la comida gringa, así es que pues eso no se puede cambiar. También me ha ayudado mucho el acompañar a diferentes movimientos sociales. Siempre he trabajado junto con los latinos de aquí, con los latinos de Latinoamérica. Entonces para mí eso me ha enriquecido mi conocimiento y también el interactuar con las poblaciones de Estados Unidos. También conozco Primitivo, porque en mis caminares, ¿quién no va a conocer a Primitivo?
Muchas gracias. Eso es exactamente lo que quería escribir en este libro de Patrias, o sea, la historia de la última migración que hemos visto, que son los mexicanos, y creo que usted lo capta muy bien. Muchas gracias.
Pues gracias a todos por estar aquí. Creo que ha sido una muy rica conversación, un privilegio poder tener esta noche no solo al autor del libro Alfredo, sino a dos de sus tres grandes amigos en el libro, David, Ken y Primitivo, que ha estado presente en espíritu con todos los recuerdos. Y simplemente decirles que es muy importante para nosotros como embajada, como instituto cultural, hacer estas presentaciones, mantener estos diálogos, estar cada vez más cerca de la comunidad mexicana, de la comunidad mexicano-americana, que sabemos que está cambiando, sabemos que es necesario abrir un consulado en Nashville, Tennessee, porque tenemos más de 300,000 mexicanos. Y el consulado más cercano es Atlanta y está muy lejos. Sabemos que los mexicanos están ahora por todo Estados Unidos y cambiando los perfiles de los mexicanos. Sabemos que, como dice Alfredo, a donde yo voy, todo el mundo me dice, embajadora, necesitamos trabajadores mexicanos. La industria del cangrejo está quebrando en Maryland sin trabajadores mexicanos. La industria lechera está quebrando en Wisconsin sin trabajadores mexicanos. Los trabajadores mexicanos son los que están en las granjas de caballos en Maryland, en Kentucky. Y eso es uno de los retos que tenemos, que la ideología en este país y las discusiones van por un lado y la realidad por otro, y muy diferentes. Entonces, ¿cómo hacemos en el futuro compaginar esas realidades esas necesidades y desideologizar y reconocer toda la enorme contribución que hemos hecho. Y creo que el libro de Alfredo es una gran contribución a este mejor conocimiento de la comunidad de México, como también lo es el libro de Andrew de Vanishing Frontiers. Gracias, perdón, Alfredo. Así que les agradezco muchísimo la presencia aquí. Vayamos a disfrutar un poco de Siembra Azul, a que vean los primeros en ver el altar de muertos de este año, que es ya muy famoso. Bueno, tan es famosa la tradición que hoy en el Congreso visité 2 altares de muertos y nos faltó otro. El Hispanic Caucus el Caucus hispano puso un altar de muertos, Raúl Grijalva puso otro altar de muertos, Lucille Roybal Allard otro altar de muertos y Chuy García otro altar de muertos. Así que ahí la llevamos.
Pues por favor acompáñenos aquí al comedor y gracias a los que nos vieron por live streaming el día de hoy.